I'm Anastasia Chapik with New Resources Consulting. And first, I would like to thank everybody for being with us this afternoon and joining us today for a conversation about the partnership between business and IT. Being in sales, we quite often use the word partner or partnership, and we use it when we try to describe the type of relationship we desire to have with our clients. And it is a word that means we solve problems together, we will have trust and transparency with each other, we will have open communication, and we'll speak the same language, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So if you're a member of an IT department today or running an IT organization, whether it is a team, a department, or division, you're most likely wrestling with questions like, how do I elevate the value that my IT organization brings to the business? How do I move from being an organization that is viewed as a cost center to an IT that's really viewed as a profit center? And how do I create more agility within my IT team to drive change and to implement new solutions? So to address some of those questions today, we're joined by Jody McDonough. Many of you know that Jody is the CIO of Sub-Zero and has a long track record of success transforming IT organizations in a variety of private and public global organizations. So he will speak about what it takes to step on that transformational journey, as well as the changes, challenges, and opportunities that go along with it. So before I hand it over to Jody, I just want to hit on a couple of quick logistics. Everyone except the presenter and myself are currently on mute, so please do not unmute yourself unless you have a question to ask. And we strongly encourage you to think about some questions to ask Jody. You have the ability to ask questions via chat, or you can also ask questions verbally at the end of the presentation. And lastly, this presentation is being recorded. If you have an issue with that, please feel free to disconnect. Otherwise, you will get a copy of the recording at the end of the presentation. So, and with that, Jody, over to you.
Thank you very much, Anastasia, and welcome everyone. And hopefully you're having a good day so far, and you'll find this useful. As she said, there's definitely a need to figure out how to bridge that gap and really establish a good partnership. And hopefully today I can provide at least a few tidbits that I have found to make that valuable over the time. I'll talk a little bit about my background, first of all, so you have an idea of why maybe I can talk about this one. Then we'll go into context and perceptions, which establish the baseline. And then how do you establish that value that she mentioned earlier? And then, of course, potential advancements to support that partnership and what you might have to do in that space. So we'll jump into it right away. A little bit. I'm a Wisconsin native. Born in Wisconsin, went to school here, but did leave for a while, went out to the West Coast and eventually came back. I was able to have the privilege of starting two companies, of which then I sold the last one in 2008 at the right time, right before the economy had a little bump there. And spent a couple of years with the acquiring company before joining a global company. All of my time up to that point was with just basically North America-based companies or my own companies. And I really wanted to go off and have a global public experience. After doing that for a while, I definitely wanted to get back into a privately owned company and did that 2.5 years ago when I joined Sub-Zero Group. So the whole thing here is, how do you move from that cost center perspective to a business partner? And context is really key. And you might ask, well, what do you mean by that? And it is, you have to understand first what context you are seen in by the business. And I have found the best way of doing that is just going out and talking to folks. I had the privilege of when I joined Sub-Zero that the other CIO was retiring. So we had about 3 months we overlapped. So for those 3 months, I was able to spend a lot of time meeting with my peers at the executive team and then doing skip levels down to all levels within the organization to find out how IT was viewed within the organization. Once you do that, and you don't try to do a lot of convincing or selling or anything at that point, you want them just to be able to open up and tell you, but then you have to evaluate. And some of the key things that I always say you have to watch for or go through and look for is how they understand that perception and starting to look at it and say, do they start talking to you about, well, that's who I go to when I need my laptop fixed, or they're there to support my application, or they keep the lights on. And of course, the real killer is if they say, well, that's a cost center within there, they're just that's part of our overhead of our business. Those points, if you start hearing those words, there's some work definitely that needs to be done to change that perception. And what you're really looking for are things like it is a partnership, or they help me deliver value, or they, allow me to, increase revenue or reduce cost. It's those type of value propositions that you're really looking for. And that's the key. And so once you understand that, you can start then talking about what's your path to start making those impactful changes. Now, the value to me is the key one. At the end of the day, if you really want to have a strong partnership and if you want to be able to impact your organization, you have to be delivering value. And to the point that even any presentations we do, we don't talk about the number of applications really anymore. We don't talk about what our architectural status of our apps are, where we are on the cost. We turn everything into the value that we've generated. But what I have found as I've done this talk, multiple times, a lot of people go back and say, well, how do I start trying to figure out to change that value proposition? So that's where I will spend a few minutes talking about that, and then I can see if there's any questions that we might want to bring up following that. So to establish that new paradigm, I've kind of over the years generated this formula about how to, you know, impact IT value. And I've really broken it down to three components. So the first one is the agility. How agile is IT as an organization? So basically, that really means how fast can you respond to business demands? How can you embrace change? And how you do that. Now, you can do this. You don't have to be an agile team to do that, but the worst thing you want to have is the business saying, well, if I go to IT, it's going to take 6 months or 9 months to get in there. And so I just really don't want to do that. So that means they aren't seeing you as an agile, a part or a department that's very agile. So that agility is the first component. Then you have to, introduce some innovation into it. And I know that's probably an overused term a little bit, but really what I mean by the innovation side is how do you bring some just creative thoughts, new ideas to your business partner? And what happens then if you start taking those two things and you start doing them together, they multiply out and they start increasing that value as seen by your business partners. So you want to be able to move each one of those, and you can move one separate from the other one, but you always want to be keeping both of those in mind as you go through that. But there is a third component that I have found that really can have a huge impact. So I make that an exponential value in this calculation, and that is a culture fit between IT and your business. And that really is looking at the leadership, the interactions, the values, the beliefs, all of those things that can go in there. So you might be able to implement the most agile department. You'll have a lot of creative thinkers within your department introducing new ideas. But if you don't fit into that business teams, business units, divisions, culture, that can really wipe out any one. So again, agility, if you're a 10 out of 10 and innovation 10 out of 10, you got a score of 100. But if your culture is 0, you take that value all the way down to a 1 just because you don't fit. So it really takes all three of those things together. And once you fit into that department's culture, or you can blend your IT culture and that department's culture together, you will see exponential results. So it really, these three things. Now, again, I will go into, there's a lot of things that go into becoming, agile as a department and what it takes to be able to create that innovative concept. So this is a fairly simple formula, but it is complex in how you implement it. So I will take just a quick break there and see if there's any questions or anything so far. Otherwise, I can move on to the next section to talk about how you can start impacting this formula. All right. So to impact that partner or that formula in becoming that partner that you want to be, I've kind of broken it down to these 5 things. And it really starts with, how do you solve problems together? You don't want to be able to have the business coming to you as IT and telling you the solution. And likewise, you don't want to be the one going back to the business and telling the business, here's the solution due for you. It should be something that you work on together. And that really does take, some effort, because, over time, everyone seems to have their own territories that you want to do. And you've got to break down any of that tension between there and start working together completely on the solving the problems. And that is first getting to understand what the problems are, so you know how to solve them with them, and having them being able to open up to you and tell you about their problems. Now, once you start getting that interaction going, to build upon what you're trying to do as a partner, you have to be transparent. And I always find it interesting that a lot of departments then, depending on how you do status reports or interactions back to them, they don't like telling them if maybe something's going wrong. But I find just the opposite, is that I want to tell them soon. I want to be completely transparent with them, because I find then they help solve the problem, maybe to get it back on track, or start providing options to make sure that everything continues successfully forward. So transparency goes along with then solving problems together. Now, to be transparent means you need to have good communication. You got to have open communication. So that is the next step, is that those people that are working between there and building that relationship between the departments have to have very good communication skills. Even, you may not have anything to update them on, but you want to update them that you don't have anything to update on. Sometimes you'll have to over communicate early to establish a good communication rhythm with them. And now those 3 things together then start building a trust. Once they see that you're being transparent, that you're letting them know everything, you're communicating about that, and they can see that you're bringing options to them and solutions, there's a trust that starts building, and that starts solidifying a bond between the departments, which allows you now to say you have a great partnership. And then I literally think that the real success that I find is when they start allowing you to be strategic with them. If you get invited to their strategic planning, or I've had the privilege of them actually asking me at times to lead their strategic planning as a department, to bring different perspectives in, that elevates it to a level of partnership when you have that type of trust between each other and openness, that I really, you've now established a good partnership. So that's those things. Now, again, there's just 5 things listed there. None of them are easy by themselves. They can all be worked on independently, but I think those are a basis to being able to establish, bridging that gap between the departments, and when you can start really calling each other a partner. Now, everyone's probably sitting there going, okay, that's all it is. It's those 5. I'm good to go, right? And I will say, well, let's not jump there. There's definitely other things that we have to do to be able to work on that. And so that's where I'll go into this next section about internal changes that I have found that a lot of IT departments have to consider to be able to deliver and to establish that relationship and that agility and innovation. So going back to that formula, I find that an operating model review, and many times maybe alteration or implementation of a complete new operating model is needed. Now, I think every business has to evaluate what their business partners are looking for, going back to that context, and have to choose the right operating model that fits your situation. I'll spend a little bit more time on operating model after I go through this, because it's the number one question I get about what operating model has worked for you. And so I'll at least go over and describe what I am doing here in my latest role at Sub-Zero. Now, on top of that operating model, the one part of the operating model that I have found to be an absolutely crucial key is a strong architecture practice. That means having some, depending how large you are, you may have a full enterprise architecture, domain architects, and solution architects. If you're a little smaller organization, having a small group of individuals that have a good architecture mindset, and how do you bring them together? There's definitely options, but you want to be able to establish architecture standards and guardrails for the other items that are coming up later. And you'll see that in the operating model, why I think architecture is so key. The third part then is, remember, that transparency and open communication that you need between the departments. You need to make sure you have the right partner roles. Who is going to interact with that business unit or your business partner? And again, that partner role has to be able to fit into that culture and establish a culture that bridges it to exponentially drive that value. And so you have to determine what's the right type of role and then the right type of person. And I've had some times where I put a person in place and we've had to make changes because it just didn't mesh. We could see right away that it wasn't fitting and wasn't driving the value that we expected. And so you may have to make changes at times, and that you have to be open to that. You have to be able to recognize if you're actually delivering that value. So getting those partner roles established and how you fit that into your organization and operating model, again, is key. Now, the fourth one on the list, I'll say most people come back and say, I just don't get why this is key. But data as an asset, treated as an asset, to me is what is actually needed to especially drive innovation and agility. Because what you're ultimately want to do is you want to empower teams to move as quickly as they can, to be flexible, respond to that external stimulation or demands that are needed, that the business is trying to react to. And you want to be able to have all the data available and accessible to do that. Because as we move into the digital age, what is really digital? It's generating a lot of data, and we need to have guardrails around that data, who can access it, how we can use it, and it's to the right level. So data as an asset to me is key, which means then you have to have some good organizational components in, like data governance and everything else that you establish between the business and that. Again, having them have some ownership in that, building that partnership. Now, in that formula, innovation was a component. So, your internal changes, you have to think about how you're going to make your team innovative. And now, again, it's just about being creative solutions, thinking a little differently, having different options. And so there's a couple different ways. You can go through and do a lot of things in design thinking. We go off and offer days a year to every employee that they can just go off and try new things. They can go out and experiment. They can suggest experiments that we might want to do as a department. And those experiments may work, they may not work, but you're always learning from that. And by that, it keeps broadening your knowledge set so that you can think differently about it, or you can provide different options as you're going through that. So that is a form of innovation that you want to be able to bring your business partners. And so you have to build that into your plan, though, and make sure that you allow for that to happen and that you help promote it and keep ushering that through. And then eventually it just becomes kind of self-sustaining, but it is very purposeful at the early stages that you have to watch and monitor that. Now, the next component is financial management. And so the reason I put that in there is and some departments and some companies will do complete build back, that the IT is then completely distributed out to other business units. You probably have some of this in place, but for a lot of companies I found that's not the case. So instead of having build back, I like doing show back. I like going to the business partners multiple times during the year and showing them exactly what we are spending money on for them to support them. And that will come back to every software component, or what portion of the software they're being allocated, what's the annual support cost, how many hours that we do against supporting their applications or responding to tickets from their department, all of that, so that we can go back and divide up all of our labor costs, all of our hardware costs, all of our software costs, and be able to allocate and show that to the department. Once you start having that transparency again, going back to transparency, financial one, you'll find that they become a partner with you in one on how to manage that cost. And I've even gotten to the point now that I have them come to the table with me during the IT budgeting process that if we're going to have an increase in the IT budget relative to their area, they can actually speak to the value that's going to help drive. And it's not IT taking on the burden of trying to sell for the business. The business is at the table with you, requesting budget changes. Now, a lot of times that simple one, being able to do that show back, makes a lot of changes within your department necessary. And that I know I was not um, a big when I joined the company and I wanted to do time tracking, not everyone was very happy to have me join the company at that point, was they didn't want to do time tracking. But now that they see that that one piece started providing this other data and the benefits that it's brought along, they understand why it was so critical in what we do. So you will have to go through that and start talking about how to start doing all your tracking of your expenses and management. You might work with your finance department to have the right tracking abilities to get that cost all together to be able to do a full showback model. And then the other part that you want to do is you want to be able to figure out how to empower your partner as well. So in the end of the day, one of the things to really drive that agility factor is how can they get in there and start solving some of those solutions together. So the easy spot that many companies have done over the years is down to data visualization. How do you give them, tools like Tableau, Power BI? Today now starting to get into the analytics platforms that they might start doing some work there in data analysis. And again, that's why that data as an asset is so critical, is that you have to be able to manage that data effectively and know what they need access to, then they can share it appropriately. But it's always thinking about how do you empower that partner. And of course, now it's starting to go into low code apps and how you're going to manage that. So that means as a department, you have to figure out what you're going to need to do to implement to also empower your partner and then have the right controls and that to not create additional risk or data leakage potential and IP leakage and so forth within your organization. So those are really some of the basic, what I say, internal changes that a lot of IT departments have to go through to start really supporting that value, IT value generation.
And Jody, this is Anastasia. So we have one quick question from the audience. So obviously the list of these internal changes that you just walked through is quite extensive, right? And as an organization that is just either thinking about or just stopping on, in early stages of this journey of transformation, are some of these changes more important to address sooner rather than later? Do you address them, like, do they all have to be present for this transformation to work? Where do you start, I guess? Do you have to tackle some of them first to build a foundation and then go to the next? So what's your approach? What has been your experience?
Yeah, and that's a great question. And because I've even had that within my department early on, I somewhat put the list in the order that I have found that when I looked back over my history is the approach that I've went. So I've always been able to identify the operating model that I've wanted to put in first. Now, I will, be completely honest. It takes years to sometimes to make these operating model changes, but at least you have to have that North Star so that you can make incremental changes. And then usually what I do is go in my new operating model, I start building that architecture practice as if it doesn't exist, and then establish those partner roles. And they kind of feeds on top of each other and kind of go. So if I had to recommend an order or a sequence or the importance to go on, I always start with that operating model because that's got to be your North Star first. And it starts impacting all your decisions that you're going to do down in the other ones. But there's definitely some that you can do in parallel. Financial management you can do in parallel while you're implementing your operating model. But that's the order that I have found that has worked for me.
Great. Thank you.
You bet. So with that, that, as I said, that's been the number one question over the time as well. What's the operating model, or what structure have you found? And again, I will say that I've went through this multiple times, and the operating model has been different each time. but I will walk through at least the one that we're doing here at Sub-Zero to give you an idea, and I can explain some of the reasoning behind it to give you at least the thought process that we went through, as you might then have to evaluate what your operating model might look like. So first, I'll just roughly talk about those green boxes around the outside here. We have a shared services group. There are certain services that IT provides the organization that are just always going to be IT services. Those will be your networking and your communications and your Wi-Fi and your voice systems and maybe AV, depending on if that lives in your world or not. But kind of those things that are just general and things that every product or platform or team is going to use. And so that's your shared services team. And then we have IT operations. What do you need to run your IT department effectively? So I put over in there, your disaster recovery, your project, maybe your PMO, stuff like that. And, those things, financial management, budgeting process, time tracking, your ITIL, all that's over in the IT operations bucket. And then you need some governance, because to have these things all work and everyone's working at a different pace, different speed, and that you'll have your IT governance team that you're going to have to then put structure around those, red, pinkish, whatever color they might show up for you in the middle. Now, there's one more box in green that I'll talk to, and that centers of excellence. And centers of excellence to me is a very dynamic group, and what is in a center of excellence changes actually over time. And so the approach that we have, at least at Sub-Zero, and I've done, is you may establish a center of excellence when it's fairly new to the enterprise or organization. And then as that matures and gets along, a lot of times what we do is take that center of excellence then and then disband that out to the business and or product and platform teams, and then add governance over top of that center of excellence. So give you an example, IT here when I joined had a center of excellence around data visualization. So one of the things we did right away is like, well, that shouldn't just be a sole IT item. Let's go out and empower the business, and the product and platform team should have their own BI resources. So we basically took that team, distributed those responsibilities out to the product and platform teams in the business. But then you create a head of data visualization that is going to put all the frameworks around. They're going to offer training to the business. There's going to be a review process of reports that are, that are more than just a departmental report. If it's going to be something that's going to go out to the enterprise, then we certify that report by the governance organization, adds all that on there. So it becomes a governance process. So that's kind of the idea around the centers of excellence. Really, the core of to be that agility, though, is those boxes in the middle, the product and platform teams. And we take the principle around the product and platform teams are the same, that these are self-contained teams. They should have all of the resources they need to operate at their own pace and to deliver what they need themselves. The difference between the two is a product team is a very clear-cut line of what it's producing. It has its own defined budget, and it has a very defined product owner or business partner, depending on what terminology you want to use when you implement that. And that business partner or product owner can define what's going to be released on every increment. It can just go. A platform team, we say, it's not as clear cut. So I always say an ERP system is what we would have an example of a platform team where there's many groups that use that platform. And even though they each have their own area, they really impact the other ones if we let them go and do too many changes that it has to be coordinated across other groups. So we still make that a completely self-contained team to move at their own pace is the desire there, but they may have to deal with multiple then product owners or business partners. And then you're going to have to really be able to work on how to prioritize those things across multiple people. Now, that's a traditional problem that you always have, but the idea is that, again, they're completely self-contained. So again, moving from basically a operating model that was skills based, where you might have had traditionally then a DBA group over here and a system engineer group and a network team and a .NET team and Java team, stuff like that. What we do is put all those people that are needed into those product and platform teams. So they have their own system engineer, they have their own security analyst, they have their developers, and they all can move at their own pace needed. So that's really the key there. So this is one of the reasons that I say architecture is so key, because as soon as you start putting all of those teams in there and they have all those resources and they can move at their own pace, you have to be able to provide them guardrails to know what they can do within their own time and when they have to invoke or have a review done if they're going to try to implement anything new. Because what you don't want to happen in this is for them to go out there and start creating, a large number of new applications or licensing or a whole bunch of SaaS services, which are going to increase your portfolio, which ultimately then can create additional risk and cost and just becoming more and more unmanageable. So how do you have to optimize? So the balance is having a good architecture or IT governance process over top of those teams to make sure that doesn't sprawl too much. So with that is it's really a shift to enablement. So once again, going back to that priority and that question before, once you kind of choose your operating model, then what do you have to do to enable that operating model? So, for ourselves, we had to move to a DevOps model, and then we had to establish a cloud enablement. So we wanted to move from a highly on-prem traditional data center mentality. So that meant creating a center of excellence about cloud enablement to establish those practices to enable those teams to move at their own pace. We have recently added a COE around analytics and getting that matured out, starting to build the standards around it, and then eventually we'll disperse that out. And then, of course, SecOps being distributed out with full automation and implementing RBAC. And then we established a Scrum practice. So that was one of the things. Now we do run a mixture yet today. Some teams will run more traditional, but for the most part, we have moved over to that, and SAFe methodology is what we've been implementing for our product teams, and that to work and go. And I already talked about the expanded governance and architecture, getting that architecture review board done. And then because you want to really, all this data needs to be able to be shareable between all these teams to really derive value, that's where you have to really get into a very strong data governance practice. Security, I can never say enough about security, always being able to put that in place in there. And then we've started introducing now low code options that the business can start doing, which means we had to establish governance about how we were going to do low code applications, and then again establish that training regiment and other components for that. So these were just some of those things that we had to start doing. Again, once we picked our operating model and moved down that list, these were the items that have been done over the last couple of years to start enabling that operating model. Now, you can imagine, wow, that seems like a lot of changes, and there was. That definitely impacts your team. So to not have it so detrimental and slow down what you're going to do the business, it was developed into a multi-year plan. We're entering into year 3 of that plan right now. And then what you do, though, is you work with your teams to always find new areas of opportunity for them, because as they move into these product teams, where can they grow? So that's really then broadening your skill sets and knowledge. And again, so that's being able to provide enough time to those teams to be able to continue to do that and find new ways and look at things differently. And so we make incremental alignment steps, probably more frequent than 6 months, for sure on an annual basis. We'll go through and look at resource alignment, and then we'll review that team and business, IT team and business alignment to make sure, again, everything's fitting and we're driving that IT value in the right direction. So it's, you also have to then put in how you're going to measure some of these things. And so we've implemented OKRs, objectives and key results, that we kind of use to measure, and we work on a quarterly basis to make sure that we're all going about. So just a few examples, a little bit on how at least our operating model and all of those things work together to do that. So I don't know if that generates any questions or any other things that you might want to ask about.
We actually do have a couple of questions, Jody. So the first one, really looking at the talent itself and what that shift really means from the talent perspective. So you talked about the kind of creating the operating model, and obviously having the technical expertise is the foundation and key. But it seems like to make this transformation successful, just the technical skills will not be enough in the operating model. So what is required from the skills and capabilities perspective? Because you talked a lot about communication and, being that partner and having that trust. So how easy or difficult have you found making that shift? So above and beyond just the technical skills and expertise of your team.
Well, it's the most difficult thing, especially in today's world. Even if you get approved to go out and hire headcount to do some of this, it's very hard to find people. So what we've had to do is, again, look at kind of thinking of that value format and say, what tasks do we do today? And are there different ways of doing those? Now, some of that may be outsourcing things to a managed service, which will take time off of someone's plate to allow them to expand their skill sets. You have to review all of that talent. If there is a turnover, you just don't backfill for that same one. What do you need to fit into your operating model and that team? So you have to take all of these opportunities and look at that. And then just building in satisfactory time to allow people to go off and learn new items. And that's been the key, is that all of the leaders over these different product, teams or platform teams, they really have to work on making sure that they're putting into, and if you're using a sprint and you got a number of points or however you might measure your velocity out of your sprint team, you got to look at that and say, how am I going to build some time in there to allow them to broaden those skill sets and knowledge? So it's got to be this constant learning process. And then at times, we will move people out of a traditional role because we need someone over here. And so it really goes, when you're doing hiring now, we don't hire as much for skills. We're really looking for that good communicator that has a ton of talent, because we can then teach them the skills we need. That's really the hiring process that we have to shift to now.
Great. Thank you. The other question is a little bit different, but it really hits on what ideas you have to enforce the business. And I don't know if enforce is the right word, but enforce the business to own the budget and limit the sometimes seems endless scope creep, especially when teams are empowered via the agile process.
Yeah. So I don't know. Yeah, enforce is a hard word. So because you're sitting down together, we always try to say we have to be good stewards for the company. Here's what we're spending, on your department. You look at that. I have found that a lot of business groups, once we started doing showback, they started asking their own people, why are we paying that much for that? We barely use that, or I didn't even know we used that. And those questions came up. And so they started just reflecting on that. And I found that that really helped manage it. And then because they're aware of that, in our budgeting process, I moved us to the point of we establish a base every year. And if a department wants to do something, we call that a base add. Then if they want to add a new software package, and I'm going to say, well, that's going to increase our base annually every year for this amount. And then it's going to be this much to implement. They have to go into the budgeting meeting and ask for that, essentially that increase. So they're asking and they're pitching an IT budget increase to add that capability. And so in that ask, they're going to have to generate that value and say, this is going to have this, advantage, efficiency gain, or whatever the impact is going to be. And you find that becomes the regulation process. Now that works for at least my history of the budgeting process. You may have to adjust that, but that's what we have found, that partnership, it really works. Now that scope creep, what we've done there is goes back to that governance process. Early on in the product teams, we'll let them go and do n number of sprints, whatever their basis is, but at least on a quarterly basis, they have to go back to a governance team, of which is a cross-functional team between IT and the business groups, and they have to show the value that they've generated in that quarter. So we We didn't stop them from doing the work, but then they come back and they tell us what they've delivered in that quarter and the value that's done. Now, if we start seeing that, hey, we really didn't need that, or that really didn't have the impact and so forth, you can start guiding them and giving them feedback. So as they go forward in their next quarter and so forth, they start having some ideas of how to prioritize their work. And we have found that so far very effective in making sure that those product teams haven't went off and just went out of control.
Okay, thank you. So we have a few more minutes to go. I would encourage the audience again to think about some questions. And this is obviously a great opportunity to ask Jody as you're reflecting on some of the insights. At this point, Jody, we addressed all the questions that have come in so far.
Okay. So just a few parting thoughts on that as wrap up. The idea is really focusing on business value. How do you change that one? So you've heard me probably use that word over and over and over again, but it really has been the key when we can go out and have the discussions about the value that's generating, and we both talk the same language, that is the IT and the business partner. We're talking about the same one. And so a statement that we have here is, our success is their success. We measure a lot of our success in IT through the same metrics that the business partner does. We'll have our own metrics internally to make sure that we're building and supporting the operating model, but really it's those metrics at the enterprise level or the department level of our business partners that we also use for ours. And so that way we have a vested interest in moving their metrics for them. And then by having that vested interest, they make sure that they have a great partnership there so we can work together on that. I also then, the reason I like the product and the platform teams is I like having them say, okay, this may be something the business wants, but break it down into smaller incremental value that you can generate. One that does a couple things. It keeps the business engaged in your partnership and going through a regular process. It limits the impact and the change management that may go along with that. But it also gives us that opportunity, that governance, to make sure that we can see that it is generating the value we want, and we can decide if we want to continue down that path, or we may now have learned enough from the incremental value that we don't want to go any farther with that. So breaking that down and having smaller, generated value that you can point to really allows you not to allow that scope creep, and to make sure that it's doing what you expected and being able to adjust your trajectory if you want. Agility, how do you start doing that? How do you start changing all those foundational items to be agile as a department and as a business? And how can you react to those stimuli outside of your business that are really going to make you have to change directions quickly, i.e. a pandemic potentially? And then, I think I've made this clear, but make the architecture investment. And that is probably, I find, the hardest step of all of those, because if you go off and talk about architecture, and you're talking about HR trying to add new people, they're going to come back and they're going to well, how are you reducing costs with these people? Or how are we getting more done? Or how are we generating revenue? Or impacting the quality of the product? And all of those questions. And it's really hard to point to those direct items with architecture. Usually, especially at enterprise architecture level, it may take years to see the benefits of those decisions and those guardrails. So it really has to become as a foundational investment. And I consider 3 or 4 things very foundational. One being architecture, one being a data foundation, another one being your cloud enablement. And when I say cloud enablement, that also means private cloud and public cloud. So I'm talking about even how to make your data center into a cloud, private cloud. And then how you're doing that training on new skills and being flexible on that. So those are kind of the foundational things that you have to make investment in. The other side of that is simplicity. Simplicity becomes also a key element, because at least my time doing this, I have found that sometimes we'll over-govern, and then we'll tend to react to that, and then I don't govern enough. And so, which is fine, because you want to be able to make those adjustments and be agile, but you want to be able to measure your changes and try to find that right place where it's simple enough so it doesn't become burdensome, but yet you have enough oversight or governance in place, for an example, that allows the product team to go, but they get the right feedback to make good decisions. And then ultimately, it's all about, enablement, enabling the IT teams to work this way, and then to enable the business to be agile and giving them the right tools, the right time, and the right access. So those kind of, if you kind of keep those things all in mind, and always that IT value and how you can impact that value, it really does then come down to that drives all the small incremental decisions you'll have to make as a department to go through this transformation. So that kind of wraps up what I was going to cover today, and I'll leave some time for questions if there's any more. I know we answered some already, but if there's any more, we can definitely take them now.
Yes, Jody, there is a question that talks about, so you mentioned this is more of a transformation, that is an evolution, not a revolution. So, and you talked about some of the internal changes that need to happen, but where do you start? So what kind of prep work do you need to do to step on that journey and determine that you're prepared to step on that journey? And how long does it take until you actually feel like it's functioning as intended?
Yeah, so, well, one thing I guess is I really don't know if there's ever an end anymore. At the pace that we're all going, I think we're always going to be, at least my perspective is we're always going to be in some form of continual improvement or transformation. So what you really have to do is I always start with, what is your philosophy? Where do you want to go? Every business is different. You have to know where you're going to fit into it. So, for example, IT within Sub-Zero, we actually have a product impact because we manage all the IoT devices that go into our products. So that means we have to be able to work with engineers and all the product development, but then we have your traditional finance, HR, marketing functions that you have to support, and they all move at different paces. So we knew we had to be able to have teams run at different paces depending on the groups that they're interacting with. And so you have to evaluate what the business, and at this time, a top-down approach is how I looked at it, of what their expectations of IT were, going back to that context. And then from there, you start building off your operating model. And I always start with a North Star and say, I want to be X, in 5 years or 3 years. In the case when I came in, I set out a 3-year objective to be able to come up and do a full enablement and get product teams in. I didn't expect to have all of IT transition to that point, but I wanted to have them up and running and effective. I see it as a continual process that we're always evaluating every year to go through and say, are we ready to make another change, or is it too soon, or is the business not ready? Because your business partners also have to be ready to work in a different approach as well. So you always have to be able to measure your business partners that you're trying to, bridge that gap with, and making sure that they're ready for this type of change. So there's no hard and fast answer. You have to assess your situation.
Understand. Thank you. All right, I do not see any questions online. I also would like to give the audience an opportunity to ask questions verbally in case someone would like to unmute themselves and ask a question. Jill, let me know if you see any questions online. So I'll just give it a second. If you would like to ask a question, feel free to unmute yourself and you can articulate your question.
Hi. Hi, Jody. It's Reed Daniels.
Hi, Reed.
How are you?
Good.
If you're in a position where you don't really have control over what the bigger part of your company does, how can you make this work for your area? Or can you make this work for your area?
I think there's certain aspects you can take down within a team and implement some of that. So, some of that financial management you might be able to do for your area so that you could show back your cost or your time within your area. You definitely can do, how do you treat data? If you have control maybe over that? Can you do some data governance within your team, at least to establish those standards and a standard definitions for your teams to work with? But ultimately, it really, to do this, it does kind of take to see the full value of that. You have to really kind of do on a broader scale of how you're going to get the new roles, the partner roles, and establish that. Because unless you're a self-contained product team today that you have all the resources, you still have to interact with those other departments. So you might try to change, but they're not going to be able to support you at the pace you want. So it is kind of a foundational thing if you want to really make a bigger change. But there are some components you could do within your area.
Thanks.
Yep.
All right. Any other questions? Jill, do you see anything online? Okay. All right. Well, if anybody has any other questions in the future, feel free to follow up with me and we can filter them over to Jody and get some answers. In the meantime, I would like to thank Jody so much for your insights and perspectives. Great opportunity to think about some things and, in the spirit of continuous improvement. So great information to have and great opportunities to continue to get better. So with that, I also would like to thank the audience for spending the afternoon with us. And I also would like to mention that we are starting to transition to more in-person events going forward. And I would like to mention that in September, we're planning an in-person event where we will showcase one of our clients, which is Milwaukee Tool, and we plan to have Ryan Garlock, who is in charge of software application development at Milwaukee Tool, talk about their one key technology. So it will be in person at the Milwaukee Tool location with some demos involved. So please mark your calendars. The registration link will be available on our website very, very soon in the next day or two. So please register, put it on your calendar. We would love to have you join us in September. I believe it's September 16th, Jill, correct?
Yes, correct.
Yep, September 16th is the date. So thank you again. Jody, was great to have you join us. Appreciate everybody's presence and have a great day.
All right. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you. Take care.